It's 10 Count Vlog!
Hello and welcome to the 10 Count Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Tiller. Wherever you are and however you're listening, thanks for making us a part of your day. Before we go any further, we are fan and listener supported. We bring this podcast to you for free every Saturday. Be sure and support us by subscribing on iTunes and SoundCloud, and then while you're at it, rate us on iTunes. And if you like what you're hearing, give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review on iTunes. It takes about 5 minutes, and you'd be helping us get our name out so that we can attract new listeners and sponsors. You can also visit our website, 10countblog.wordpress.com. We post every podcast there as well as some cool blog entries. Be sure to check out this week's card reveal and predictions for Tri-State Wrestling's We Have Arrived event at the Blue Jeans Center in Monroe City, Indiana. That goes down tonight, June 11th, and you don't want to miss it if you're in the area. You can check out our social media and podcast page at 10countblog.wordpress.com. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as checking out some of our favorite podcasts. You can finally check out our local indie promotions page, where we've provided links to some of the area's hottest indie promotions. That's all at 10countblog.wordpress.com. Well, this week we have a world champion on our show, and of course we're talking about the TSW World Heavyweight Champion, Zach Hogan. At least he's the world champion for now. He's got a big match coming up on the 25th for that title at TSW's Night of Champions events. Zach chats with us about his influences, training, and working with last week's guest, Samnite, and also the dynamics of being a heel. But, we just kind of shoot the breeze as well. If you haven't met Zach, you should reach out to him. He's super down to earth and a lot of fun to talk to. One of the things that made this conversation fun was that I had just had surgery. Want to talk about dedication. But I was on some pretty powerful pain meds at the time, and we chased a few rabbits around. We also had a random drop-in from Zane Arkham, but ultimately it was a fun conversation. Zach has a lot of stuff going on right now in his life, the biggest of which is his newly attained status of dad. So we're glad to have him on the show and get him to take a few minutes out of his busy schedule. We also want to make sure that we give our friends at Rollick a plug. They've allowed us to use their song, Snorkeling into Oblivion. It's the official theme for the 10 Count Podcast. Be sure and head over to Facebook, give them a like, and take a minute and download their latest album. They give it to you for free. And if you're in the Vincennes area on June 25th around 2 p.m., go check out their event, the Rollick Frolic, at the Vincennes Riverfront Pavilion on 2nd Street. Lots of great bands on the card for that event, including friend of the show and Damian Baker and his band, the Everyday Losers. Sit back and relax. It's our pleasure to present this week's 10 Count Podcast with TSW World Heavyweight Champion, Zach Hogan. Zach Hogan, I'm so happy to have you on the podcast, and it's been an interesting journey getting here. It seems like every time we get it scheduled, something comes up, and just glad to have you on. Zach, how are you doing today?
I'm glad to be here, man. It's been rough, but we're here, so we're going to get some good stuff in today. So
yeah, absolutely. And I feel like Colt Cabana right now, and I try not to mention his name too much, but he records in some of the most interesting places. Recently, he was talking to Conan in like a hallway. He's recorded in gyms. You and I, we're sitting on a bus right now. Literally, we were trying to record outside. The wind was too strong, so we actually are on the TSW Lodge of the Wabash bus that they haul the ring in. And you got some good memories of this place. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, that's indie wrestling, man. You'll get changed in some weird places. You'll have locker rooms in weird places. I've actually gotten changed on this bus with fans about 5 feet away, and they had no idea. So that's wrestling. That's how it is in the indies, man. It's something.
And I don't think I'd have it any other way, because this has been one of the most fun things we've done. And you can hear that, probably the doors closing on us. But anyway, so Zach, we were talking a little bit earlier. Talk a little bit about how you got into wrestling. Were you a young kid when you got into it? I mean, just kind of what sparked the love of wrestling for you? Well,
I got into wrestling kind of haphazardly. I'm not from a wrestling fan family. My family doesn't understand the business. They probably never will. But it sounds kind of cheesy, but I was that kid that kind of just flipped through the channels and stumbled upon wrestling and just immediately got drawn to the characters and to the stories. And I mean, I've always been a comic book fan, and I love the hero versus villain type deal, and I just kind of got drawn into it.
And so, who were your heroes growing up watching that? Because, I mean, the area that... You and I are close to the same age, so the era we grew up watching, as far as wrestling, was, Attitude Era. These guys like Stone Cold and the end of Bret Hart's tenure with WWE. These guys who are, just legends in the business. Talk a little bit about your heroes growing up as far as that goes.
Yes, I'm a little young. So I missed the golden years of wrestling, and that's my biggest regret. I always say I was born in the wrong era. But growing up, I was always a big fan. Guys like Shawn Michaels and, those guys that he wrestled with. But I would love to have grown up in like the Flair Steamboat era. But because those are my favorite, today my favorite matches to watch is, Ricky the Dragon and, Bret Hart and Ric Flair. But can't control when you're born, I guess. But it's been a struggle for me, coming into wrestling as not a, my family never took me to the shows or anything. But I started going around to yard sales and stuff and buying old wrestling tapes and things like that, and starting to watch the old guys. And I always said that one thing I wanted to do in my life is I wanted to try to be a wrestler. And whether I'd succeed or fail, it didn't matter. I didn't want to be 50 years old one day and be too old to start and regret it the rest of my life. I always wanted to try.
And that's a great attitude, because I think I'm kind of the same way. And of course, I'm getting into it a little bit later. I'm 28 years old, and eventually my goal is to be in the ring at some point, even if it's just for a couple years. But talk a little bit about how you got your opportunity. I mean, where did the opportunity to get into a wrestling ring come for you?
Well, growing up, I was always big into martial arts, and that was always my thing growing up, and I always wanted to make a career out of it. But as I got a little bit older, I realized it wasn't for me, and really, I'm big into the storytelling part of wrestling, and you just don't have that in mixed martial arts. Really, it's not as flamboyant, not as played up, and that's my favorite part about being in wrestling is being able to play a character and the acting part, and it's great. And I was perusing Facebook one day, and I came across a training school in Evansville. It was the Vex Wrestling Academy, and that didn't end well. They didn't train me correctly, and I ended up being retrained later. But that was my foot in the door, and that got me into a ring. And then I realized once I got in the ring, that's it for me. That's my hobby. That's gonna be my life, and I want to do it until I can't do it anymore.
And you talk about Vex Wrestling, and I've heard a lot of guys on this podcast talk about getting in with Vex. Talk a little bit about those first few days, or for the early days with some of the smaller companies like Vex.
Well, the first wrestling show I ever worked, I wasn't ready. I wasn't properly trained, and I wrestled in front of 30 people, and it was kind of it was a great moment because it was my first actual wrestling match. But at the same time, I was like, is this how indie wrestling really is? Is this all it is? I wanted more. I was hungry for it. I wanted to be in front of those crowds, and I wanted people to be on their feet and cheering, and I really wanted that energy. But as I grew in the business a little bit and I moved on to bigger and better places, I found out that indie wrestling is a huge world, and it's an underground society, really. Most people don't even know exists, but it's everything to me, man. That's my life.
And so, what do you mean not properly trained? And I don't like to run shoot interviews on this podcast, but you hear a lot of people that say there's a lot of training out there, and it's training in quotation marks. It's not necessarily the best, but you need to be properly trained. What do you mean by properly trained?
I'm not shooting. I'm just being entirely honest with you. The guy that trained me, he brought me in. He was using his trainees as free workers, and he was using the wrestling company to pay his bills. It is what it is. I had 3 training sessions before I had my first match. If you talk to any legitimate trainer, that is stupid. That's a good way to get somebody hurt. And there were a lot of guys getting hurt, and we all saw the better of it, and we all moved on. And that company doesn't exist anymore because the promoter doesn't want to pay legitimate indie workers. He wants to use his trainees to pay his bills for him. So I'm not shooting. I'm just being honest. And
you hear a lot about that type of attitude and that mentality with some of these people who do the startups. They go buy a ring off of high spots, and then they they think that they're gonna start a WWE company, but in reality, they're just going to alienate their workers. So talk a little bit about the fall of Vex and, why you think that didn't come. It didn't come to what it needed to be, but then you moved on and you've made an awesome indie career for yourself here in the tri-state area. So talk a little bit about, moving on from Vex.
All right, well, the turning point for me is I had a wrestling match in 2013, February. It was with Samnite, a guy from Southern California. You've had him on your podcast before, but we had a storyline brewing, and it was getting good, and we were getting a lot of attention on social media and getting a lot of people saying they were enjoying watching. And it came to a head that night. We had a street fight, and we went hardcore, man. I couldn't hardly get out of bed the next day. It was rough, and we had a show there the next month, and the booker booked me in a squash match against a rookie, and buried the storyline completely, and just threw away everything we'd worked for. And there was no payoff. There was no end to the storyline. It was just gone. And then he booked himself against Samnite after that, and started running a storyline in the main event. And that was my last show for Vex Wrestling. And all of my peers, we all kind of stepped away at that point because it was happening to everybody.
And that's so disappointing because storytelling is the essence of wrestling. You got to be able to tell a story in the ring, and you've got to be able to let it play out. And I think that's something that's hurt some of the bigger companies, like WWE. I mean, you see all these stories just kind of get no resolution whatsoever. Talk a little bit about the art of storytelling and some of the things you've learned from that particular situation.
Well, I mean, I learned that. I mean, I was getting Facebook messages for weeks after that asking when I was going to wrestle Samnite again, if I was going to get my revenge on him for what he did to me and everything. And I was like, look, guys, I'm sorry. I'm not working for the company anymore, and Samnite's not working for the company anymore. We're not going to be able to do the match. And I realized that the people that are truly invested in watching these shows, and they come to every show, they they want to know what happens next. And if you take it away from them, they're not going to enjoy the show. And for me, that's always been my favorite part of the wrestling business. I enjoy playing somebody else on the weekends. I'm not that guy, but I love being that guy on the weekends. It's a blast to me. It's a rush. It's an adrenaline rush through and through. But after I left Vex, I found TSW, and they started putting me on their shows, and I started expanding and talking to other promoters on Facebook, and I've looked up some of their websites, and I just started making contacts. And then when I realized that it's a big world out there, and there's a lot of places to work and a lot of opportunities, that's when I knew it was okay to step away from where I started. I was comfortable with it at that point. So
let's talk a little bit about getting some of those opportunities. Now, you're one of several guys in the area that Samnite has actually done some training with, and he spoke very highly of you on our podcast, talked a little bit about putting you over in his first match with you, and what was that like? I mean, Will Bray, first thing he said, I actually asked him the same question, and the first word out of his mouth was, it was hell. Talk a little bit about training with Samnite and some of the things you've learned from him.
Samnite, you get in a ring with Samnite, he'll make you question whether you want to be a wrestler or not. But he'll push you to your breaking point. But at the end of the day, you realize that's the only way you're going to be anything in the business. You can't. There's too many posers in wrestling that just want to play a wrestler, but he'll teach you to be a wrestler. And I owe everything I know to the guy, and everything I know about being a professional. There's more to wrestling than being a wrestler. You got to be a professional, and you know from meeting him, he presents himself as a professional, and that I owe all that to him. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things he talked about was when he was at Knox Pro, and I don't want to make this about Samnite necessarily, but he talked about how they beat the mark out of you. And that kind of goes along with what you said about him presenting himself as a professional. In your mind, learning that from him, what has that done for you?
Well, that's 100% true. The first time I was in the locker room with a big-name wrestler, I was a fanboy, and I couldn't contain my excitement. But I've learned from being around these guys now that they want to be treated like a fellow wrestler. You have to show them the respect because of where they've been. But at the same time, I wrestled Rob Conway a few months ago. Nicest man you'll ever meet in your life. He's a great guy. But, I mean, being trained by some of the biggest wrestlers in the business, Gangrel and Rikishi and Black Pearl and all these guys, he was able to kind of pass on that knowledge to me and Will and several other guys that are still working in the area. But I definitely got retrained by Samnite. He got me in the ring on several occasions and blew me up, and fixed some of the flaws that I was improperly trained before, and I feel like I've benefited from it, tenfold.
What are some of the things that stick out to you about your training with Samnite? Actually the drills and the stuff that you learn physically there in the ring, because we get little snippets of it here and there. He talks about the wild Samoan drill. He talks about a couple other little things, but I mean, what are the things that stuck out to you?
Well, he definitely taught us that it doesn't matter if you can do a double backflip off the top rope and stick the landing. If 10 minutes into the match you're out of breath and you can't wrestle, and that ruins your match. And there were several drills I've thrown up on occasion. The wild Samoan drill, if you know anything about that, it's hell. Just being honest. Yeah, you'll end up laying on the ground outside the ring for about 10 minutes afterwards, trying to get the strength to get up. But it's what you got to do, man. And it really my ring work improved, not just the moves and the spots and the acting, but my actual physique benefited from it. Because there are guys that are in really good shape. They look like they're in really good shape, but they just don't have that cardio, and that cardio is the most important thing. And that's one of the biggest takeaways from his training.
And that's one of the things I think I picked up just from talking to him about it. And so let's transition from you training with Samnite and learning about the important things to becoming a professional wrestler to how it has translated to your success in the ring. There's a lot of great stuff you've got going on for you right now. I know you're wrestling for several different companies, New Focus down in Evansville, here at TSW. You're doing a lot of cool stuff. Talk a little bit about the things you're doing right now and kind of where you see some of your stuff heading.
Well, I'm in that grind right now of the young upstart indie wrestler in a world full of young upstart indie wrestlers. But right now it's that grind. I'm just trying to get in front of as many eyes as possible, because you listen to the guys that have made it, and the guys that are main event in WrestleMania and pay-per-views for WWE. They started wrestling in armories and parking lots, and I mean I've wrestled in front of some really poor crowds, but if 3 or 4 people out of that crowd remember your name and they add you and start following you on Facebook, you're starting to build a following. And you're doing the same thing with your podcast. Every time you put a podcast out, you're getting more views and more followers, and it's becoming something. And I'm in that same grind right now. And I'd love to start working for some bigger companies. I just need to build the contacts. And I'm really trying to put together a base of good matches for footage to start sending out to the bigger companies, because I would love to have a contract. I want to make a career out of wrestling.
Okay. And I think personally from watching you, I think you have what it takes to become a career wrestler. And I don't mean to just say that to blow smoke. I'll share a story with you, and then you can share some more stories with me. Okay. The first time I ever saw you wrestle was in February at Proving Grounds here at the Eagles Lodge, and you were taking on Teddy King. And man, he is a phenomenal worker. Seen all his stuff online. Saw him, of course, the one time in person. But I'll never forget, and you can call me a mark if you like, but I'll never forget the first time I saw a Canadian Destroyer was when I saw you do it to Teddy King. And I legitimately thought you had broken his neck. Talk a little bit about that match in particular, but kind of how you came to use the Canadian Destroyer, and some of the things that you do in ring.
Well, my style. I'm a brawler style. I don't do a whole lot of flashy stuff, but when I do, I want it to matter. I want to make it count. But sidetracking here, leading up to the Teddy King match, I was really excited when Stephen Mitchell he told me I was wrestling Teddy, because I'd been a fan for a while. I've seen him on some indie shows around, and if anybody around here has a chance of making a career out of wrestling, that's your guy. He's fantastic, just a natural athlete. And that was one of my favorite matches I've ever had, and I think we went about 30 minutes, and I still all the time I'm trying to finagle my way into having another match with him somewhere. I'm gonna try to get somebody to book it, because he taught me a lot in that wrestling match. We're both young guys and we're both new, But for being as new as he is, I learned a lot in that match. But the Canadian Destroyer thing, that stemmed from Vex Wrestling. And I was wrestling with the guy, his name is Lucas Smith, who ended up being one of my best friends. And he was the top heel in that company at the time, and I was the top babyface. Or not the top babyface, one of the top babyfaces, because Will Bray was there too. And he was really over with the fans. But he always used the Canadian Destroyer, and I thought, that's really cool. I wanna learn how to take that move. And I probably tried in training 10, 15 times to take it before I actually stuck it the first time. And that adrenaline rush of that being a high impact, kind of risky type move, it was a blast. And Lucas he faded out of wrestling a little bit, and life got in the way and everything. And I kind of took that as my finisher, as almost like a tribute to him, because he was the first guy I was able to really have good matches with. As being in my first year and everything, that was the first time we actually had a crowd on our feet. So I kind of do that for him, just because he kind of passed it on to me. But besides the Canadian Destroyer, I do pile drivers type deal.
And don't you do like the neutralizer, kind of like Cesaro does? Mm-hmm. I mean, you do a lot. Your arsenal of moves is actually pretty impressive.
Well, the neutralizer, I'm not gonna lie, that's my mark move, because Claudio Castagnoli was my favorite indie worker ever. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's many guys that are better than that guy, and he could have a match with a broom, and have a good match. He could wrestle nobody and have a good match. But the neutralizer, that's my guilty pleasure. I do that every now and then. That's just for me, because I've always enjoyed watching him do it. So I had to take something from him. But that's my mark move, man.
And that's okay. We're all allowed to have mark moves. I don't know what mine will be yet, but I got to ask you about the neutralizer. And of course, we had Sergeant Stanley Roberts on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he talks very highly of you. Again, everybody who talks about working with you always talks very highly of you. But he mentioned that he took a neutralizer on the floor. Talk a little bit about that match and what was memorable about it.
Well, he's crazy, and it scared me to death. I didn't want to do it, but he insisted, so I had to oblige. But all I remember, I picked him up, and I clashed him forward. And he threw himself hard at the floor, and all I heard was his knees hit the floor on that concrete, and it just sent a chill down me. I thought I heard him, but he's a champ. He can handle it. He's a real man. But yeah, that was a good match. I enjoy working with Stanley Roberts. I'll work with him anytime somebody offers. I'll work him anywhere. I'd work him in front of two people. He's a real good guy.
So let's kind of bring it back a little bit. We've chased rabbits a little bit, but that's okay. I like doing this. You mentioned, when you first got into wrestling, your first match at Vex, it was so unorganized. It was in front of like 30 people, and you were kind of sitting there thinking, if this is what indie wrestling is about, do I really want to do this? And how have your expectations changed since then, and how has the experience changed since then?
Well, I've worked a lot bigger crowds since then, and in front of fans that were invested in the matches, because in Vex, the 30 to 40 people we drew was friends and family, and most of them weren't wrestling fans. They were just there for support. So you couldn't get pops off your moves. It felt like nobody cared. But I've had the opportunity to work in front of some really good wrestling fans, and if somebody, whether they love me or hate me, which usually they hate me, but if they go home enjoying that match, that's the payoff for me. And indie wrestling's not a money sport. It's not, and it's not about that for me. I really enjoy putting on good matches and having people be able to go home and remember the match. Because if they go home and don't remember anything from the match, you didn't wow them. And that's my goal every time I go out there.
And I think, I hit that wow moment back when I watched you wrestle Teddy King, when I saw you hit the Canadian Destroyer. That match was just so good, and I keep going back to it. But even since then, you've had great matches that I've seen. There's a video on our Facebook page of you taking a super kick from Will Bray, and that's one of my favorite videos I've ever taken because, you sold it so well. And I think that's an art that gets lost sometimes in wrestling, is selling. Talk a little bit about your willingness to sell like that, because It was awesome. You just looked like you'd just gotten your lights kicked out.
Well, on the record, he did kick my lights out. He left a mark on my face from his shoe. But still, anyway, the selling is the lost art, and that's something you see a lot on the indies that separates the workers from the people that just want to play wrestler. You see somebody take a pile driver or a Canadian destroyer, then stand right up. It kills the business. It destroys that illusion. And I'm a believer that you don't have to use your finisher in every match. You could use your finisher once in a whole storyline, and that'll be your payoff at the end. That's when you get your final win. But selling, that's a little weird for me. I would rather take moves than give them. I love selling. It's great. That's my favorite part of when I watch my footage from my matches. I record all my matches. I like to watch how I sold the moves. Like I couldn't really care too much about what I'm doing offensively, especially as a heel. You need to be that way. Because the heel's whole job is to make the babyface look good. If you're not making him look good and you're just out there for yourself, it kills the whole psychology of the match. But selling is definitely huge for me. That's my main focus in a match, is trying to make the moves look believable.
All right, so let's reel it back in again. We keep getting way off topic on these weird things. But that's okay. It's kind of how our conversation went before this. But I want to talk to you a little bit about how you transitioned from being, one of the top baby faces at some of these other companies you've worked for to just this chicken shit heel that you are here at TSW. And, I mean, don't get me wrong, the heel is great. You've got a great character and you've got a great rivalry going on with Will. And I don't know if this is going to air while that's still going on, but, I mean, You just play the heel so well. Talk a little bit about your transition there and what the differences are between playing face and heel.
Well, I didn't really have a transition period. I went from working babyface at Vex Wrestling the whole time I worked there to my first match in TSW. They needed a heel. So they said, "Can you work heel?" I'm like, "I don't know, but I can try." And ever since then, I was hooked on it. I'd rather play heel 100 times before I played babyface. I enjoy the bickering with the fans, and I enjoy... you build them up in the match and get the babyface going, then you just pull the rug out from under them and steal it. I love it. And the heel character that I play, I'm not a big fan of taking clean wins. It's not what my character's about. I'm a cheater, and that's what I'm gonna be. I like to steal the match from the guy that has me the whole time. And so I didn't really have much of a transition period, but I was probably a pretty poor heel when I first started. I've not really watched a lot of that footage from my early time in TSW, but I definitely prefer working heel. Like that, I'm the guy that'll watch a superhero movie and root for the villain the whole time. I think the characters are so much more complex. That the hero, they can be one-dimensional sometimes, especially in wrestling. And there's just so much more you can do with a heel character. There's so much more complex psychologically. And
I'm gonna have a lot of editing to do in this podcast, but that's very true. And I want to kind of just touch on one of the things you said. There's more complexity to the heel. I mean, and that's so true because you look at guys like John Cena. He's very one-dimensional. Mm-hmm. Everything he comes out and says, yeah, it's sort of ish fresh every night, the stuff he says, but the delivery is just so, it's there. It's John Cena. You know what you're getting out of him. Whereas, Seth Rollins comes out this past week on Raw, and he's like thanking the crowd and talking about how much they missed him, and then he just turns heel right in the middle of the promo and just gets everybody booing him. And I love the complexity of the heel. One of the things that you do that I think makes it work for you, and just Jason's opinion personally, you're not gimmicky. You're actually somebody I can believe. When you set foot in that ring, you're somebody I believe who is just bad attitude. I don't like anybody. Why did you go that way rather than being so gimmicky?
Well, I have nothing against the real gimmicky characters, the real flashy characters, flamboyant, but it has to be done right. And if I'm going to do a gimmick like that, it really needs to be the right moment and the right time. But I like to be that character that he was that jerk in gym class that everybody hated because, he did his thing. And if you got in his way, he had a problem with you. I've got a real chip on my shoulder when I'm in the ring. And I kind of play the guy that I don't like when the babyface steals my thunder. Because I come out and I get booed. And he comes out, doesn't have to do anything. when Will Bray walks out, he just walks out and everybody's on their feet. And I use that, my character feeds off of that. And it's like, I'm almost a conflicted heel. I don't really want to be a heel sometimes, but when I get these reactions, my character is really disgruntled, and I have a short temper, and then I turn on everybody. Like, I'm real conflicted when I'm in the ring. I try to play that. I'm confused. I don't know what I want to be, but I don't like the reaction I get, so I feed off of it, and I'll pick people out in the crowd right from the second I walk out. I'm like, these are the people I'm going to be on the whole match. The super babyface fans, and then your smart marks. You have different people to target, and that's a blast. So,
and I think that's kind of like, in my mind, and please don't take this insultingly, I think you're a less gimmicky Bo Dallas, because that's kind of what he did when he first came into WWE. He was the inspirational guy, and then first time somebody says something wrong to him, he's just goes psycho on them. Yep. So, talk a little bit about the inspiration you draw sometimes from other places. And we've just been joined by Zane Arkham. Zane, how you doing, buddy?
Not too bad. Just looking for some lost stuff, and bye.
We just had our first CM Punk drop in. So
comes back and gets a pile driver.
There you go. Yeah, he comes back, he gets a pile driver. I don't know if everybody could hear that, but anyway, so I can't even remember what I'm asking you now. So let's talk a little bit about something we started out there at the pavilion where we first had our conversation, but it's something we didn't really get to answer. Talk a little bit about your thoughts on some of the bigger promotions now, and kind of the direction they're going in.
Man, to be honest, it's like the NFL anymore. It's all marketing, and it's a business. It's the WWE, TNA, places like that. They're losing the wrestling, and they're getting more into other types of media because they've discovered new places to make money, and it's a money sport, and it's really it's disheartening as a pure wrestling fan because I want to go out there and watch the wrestling, but there's so much other stuff going on with these companies that it makes me prefer watching. I'd rather watch Ring of Honor, New Japan, AAA even over WWE or TNA. To be honest, the booking's not right, and that they've got a wealth of talent that they're not using because they pick their big guys that they can put on posters and covers to their magazines and everything. That's what they go with.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with you in that. But when you say you're the pure wrestling fan, expand on that a little bit, because I hear a lot of people talk about that, but nobody ever really expands on it. Nobody says, "Well, I'm a pure wrestling fan because of X and O." What does that mean?
I enjoy the storylines. We've talked about that. That's a big part of it. But when it comes down to it, the in-ring work, I enjoy studying. Like William Regal, one of the best workers to watch. Fit Finley, guys like that. They're pure wrestlers. They're the guys that could actually legitimately wrestle you to the ground and make you submit. That's what I enjoy over the spotty type matches. But that's what wrestling used to be about, and the big companies and WWF and USWA and all these old companies back in the day before WWE became such a global force and controlled the whole market. You had a lot more, your Jerry Lawler, Bill Dundee matches. They're wars. These matches were wars, and still the best matchup I've ever watched is Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair. I mean, they could work each other. They could work a different match 10 times a day, and they'd all be good. And they'd all be unique. Those type of guys had such a mind for wrestling. And another guy's Eddie Guerrero. He did not do anything in the ring if there wasn't a reason for it. There was no wasted motion, no nothing. Everything he did made perfect sense, and that's pure wrestling to me.
I'm glad you mentioned Eddie Guerrero because, of course, I've been laid up the last couple days, and one of the things I've been doing is I've been watching a lot of WWE Network and some of the older pay-per-views, ECW, WCW, and I recently watched Starrcade 97, and that was...
Great card.
Yeah, one of the best. But you had the first match, the lead-off match was Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko. And I think as far as being a pure wrestling fan, it doesn't get much better than that.
No. If I could steal anybody's talent, it'd be Dean Malenko. I'm just going to put that out there. Malenko and Benoit, I know Benoit will always be tarnished for, obvious reasons, but one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. And like you said, Dean Malenko, he could do anything. And those type of guys they're the matches I watch to learn. And I watch things as a fan, but if you really want to get down into the technical side of wrestling, Dean Malenko, guys like that, they're your guys. They're fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And, of course, watching that Starrcade 97, you see Chris Benoit start taking on Raven. And Raven, of course, he's known for being a little crazier, more out there, but when it comes down to it, his technical wrestling is actually really good. Perry Saturn, another one of those guys, it was a really good, pure wrestler. And I don't want to sit here and just keep on and on and on about some of these bigger guys, but, these are the people that we as fans see, and then when, you becoming a wrestler and being a fan of this type, you kind of model yourself after these guys. So talk a little bit about, in a perfect world, you say you'd like to take Dean Malenko's talent. You'd like to be Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, some of these guys. In a perfect world, if you could wrestle any of those guys, or all of those guys even, would you do it?
That would be the biggest learning experience you could have, is working the guys that have been there and done that. That's how you learn. And my dream match would be Ricky Steamboat in his prime, or him or Shawn Michaels. Just I'm jealous of the guys that got to go to Shawn Michaels his training school before, back working with him and Rudy Gonzalez and all those guys. But for sure, definitely, I love Benoit. I love a match with Benoit. And you mentioned Dean Malenko, Chris Jericho in WCW days. Mm-hmm. Those guys, those would be my dream matches.
And I would love to see you take on some of those guys because, I say this a lot, but there's a lot of talent in this area. And as far as I'm concerned, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings or offend anybody by saying this, but in my opinion, you're kind of at the top of that list because you do work so well and you work so much. And, obviously it comes out. You're the champion here in TSW. And I'm wanting to transition a little bit, talk a little bit more about your success here in the Indies and this area. Talk a little bit about your first championship match. And I've heard this story before secondhand. I want to hear your version of it.
My first championship match was against Samnite, and it was for the TSW Southern Championship. And it was kind of a trial run to see if I was ready to hold a championship. And I put him over. He beat me and retained my first title match. But during the match, I got lost. I let it get the best of me. I got lost. And I'm going to tell you what, don't get lost in a match with Sam Knight when it's high profile like that. He clocked me in the face so hard, snapped me right back into the match, and we finished. And that was, I was kind of dealing with some outside stuff, outside of wrestling at the time, in my personal life, and I didn't know if I had what it took to hang with those type of guys, because I'd never been pushed that hard. And that series of matches I had with Sam Knight kind of made me realize that if I stick with it and I work really hard, I can be one of those guys, and it's not too out of reach, So that was really a motivator for me, being in there with somebody I idolize in wrestling and getting to learn straight from him. And when I won my first championship, it was from him. So it meant a lot to me. It was a good memory.
And I've seen, pictures on your Facebook page of you with the TSW Southern Championship. When did you drop that title? I don't even know.
The Southern Championship, that was at Night of Champions last year. I dropped to Zane Arkham in First Blood match, which that was a lot of fun. But
talk a little bit about that match, because I Steve, watching him wrestle, he seems like he's into that kind of stuff. And of course, he's had his issues with cancer and stuff like that. And I think we all wish him well and wish him a very quick recovery so he can get back. But talk a little bit about doing that kind of match with him, because again, he was one of those guys who spoke very highly of working with you.
Okay, Steven, that's a guy. Another one of those guys I'll wrestle anytime. The thing about working with Steven is you can do anything you want in the match. He's not scared of anything, and he doesn't have limits that most people have. You can go out there and it's just a fight with him, and we can go out there and kill each other in that match and hardly be able to walk back to the locker room and then go have a beer together. It's that type of working relationship that I love about wrestling. It's like no other sport in the world. But the series of matches I had with him, we did 2 or 3 big matches in a row, and it led up to that hardcore match, the first blood match, and that was a battle. That was a battle. He ended up hitting me in the head with the sledgehammer to win, and he didn't pull it very much. So, yeah, he rung my bell, and then preceding that, Samnite came out and speared me, and then Steven picked me back up and gave me the clothesline from hell, and the whole time I'm half unconscious. If you go back and watch the footage, my eyes are in another place. I'm glazed over. I look so out of it. But that was a really good memory. That was my first time putting over a babyface for a title, and after a long build-up, because we had been working consistently for about 6 months leading up to that, and it was a good payoff, and it felt right because the people were invested in it, the fans were invested in it, and the whole story made sense. And that was one of the first angles that I actually finished all the way to the end without any interruptions or anything, anybody getting hurt or promoters changing the cards, or it felt really good. And it sounds weird laying on my back in my own blood, looking up at somebody holding my title, but it really was in a weird way. It was a good payoff.
And that's neat. I think that's ultimately where you want to be, is you want the storyline to pay off and you want to feel like you've accomplished something. Is that a pretty accurate statement? Yeah,
of course. It's something you can always look back on and rewatch the footage later and see that you really had something going, and it's something you could be proud of.
So, Zach, we're running low on time, but there's a couple more things I wanted to talk to you about. Of course, you wrestle for lots of different promotions around here, and we've touched on that a couple times, but I don't think we've actually delved into it a little bit. Talk a little bit about working for, like, New Focus and some of the others down in Evansville, but you've also worked for other different places as well. Talk a little bit about your travels and kind of how much you're on the road and all the stuff you're doing right now.
Well, I've been working for several companies, and to be honest, every company you work for is a whole nother world, and every company has their own group of guys. But something I've noticed working all these companies around here, there's usually 3 or 4 guys that you're seeing everywhere, and they're really trying to market themselves. Every company's got the guys that stay put, and every company's got the guys that are traveling, trying to get on every card they can. And it's neat to come across people you didn't know were going to be on a show. When you show up to a show. I've worked against Will Bray and New Wave Pro in Terre Haute, and I've worked with him here, and we had a history in Vex Wrestling too. So Terrence, I trained with Terrence, another fantastic wrestler, and he's showing up on a lot of the shows I'm working. And mainly I'm working for TSW, New Focus Wrestling in Evansville, they run at the Coliseum frequently now, and New Wave Pro. But I'm wanting to broaden a little bit. I want to work at UWC in Georgetown and different places like that. But I kind of like to stay in my group of people more than I should. But I know, like, I can get a booking with Samnite, and I know going there I can trust the people at the company because he knows who to hang with. He's got more contacts than I do. So I try to model myself like that. Like, you know, if he's going to spend his whole day traveling somewhere, it's going to be a good show. And I'm going to be doing some work in Alabama with Benny Bray. We're going to go down and do some shows down there. And I want to get out to Southern California Sam Night because I want to see that scene. I want to see the heavy lucha type. It's a completely different world. I've worked with a couple of guys that he's brought in from where he used to work, and it's a completely different type of match. And I enjoy working different styles. That's how I like. You know, that's how I learn and try to build my own hybrid wrestling style. So that's something I'm really looking forward to, is going down south and trying to go west.
All right. And it sounds like you got a lot of stuff going on. One last thing before we get to and I almost dropped the phone there. One last thing I want to get to before we get to plugs and how people can support you. You never got to answer this question for me out there because I kind of gave you my opinion, but then we got interrupted. Roman Reigns, that's a big topic in wrestling right now, and you specifically asked me how I felt, and of course my thought process there was I like Roman, but I don't think he's World Heavyweight Championship material. You never gave me your opinion, so right here on 10 Count Podcast I want to hear Zach Hogan's opinion of Roman Reigns.
Well, Roman Reigns is obviously not over, and it's not entirely his fault. He has not been booked well, as you mentioned, and he hasn't been written for well. His character's very one-dimensional. He's like a tweener version of John Cena. You just really don't know what you're getting with him. You don't know, is he trying to come off as a babyface, or is he trying to come off as a heel? It's hard to tell. There's a lot of gray area with this character. But wrestling fans, if they don't want to embrace somebody as the next guy, they're not going to, and they don't want to. And there's no amount of winning pay-per-view matches and being in the big spots on Raw. None of that's going to change that. And they need to move on to something else. And that's not to say he couldn't be the guy later, but at this time he's not the guy, and he's not being embraced as the guy.
I am in 100% agreement with that. All right, so Zach, how can people support you? I know you got sponsors, you got all kinds of stuff on social media. Talk a little bit about how people can get out there and help Zach Hogan get his name out.
Facebook and Instagram. If anybody listen to this, if you're not following me, please do. I enjoy interactions with everybody. If you enjoy my stuff, I upload a lot of videos and matches to YouTube, and then I post them on my Facebook. They can share those videos and try to get it in front of many eyes as possible, and I'd appreciate it more than anything.
All right. Zach, it was great having you on the podcast.
Thank you, sir. It was great to be on.
Special thanks to Zach for being on this week's podcast. Before we go, let's get to some upcoming events. Tonight, June 11th, as we mentioned, Tri-State Wrestling makes its grand return to the Blue Jeans Center in Monroe City, Indiana. This is a long-awaited return for TSW. Doors open at 6. Bell time is at 7 Eastern Time. Tickets are $5 a piece. Kids 4 and under are free. All proceeds go to the Blue Jeans Center, and that's in Monroe City. It's a super worthy cause because this is one of the hubs of that small town, and we know they greatly appreciate the support. Friday, June 17th and Saturday, June 18th, New Wave Pro Wrestling presents the Chuck Woodard Memorial Tournament. This is a 2-night event at the NWP Arena at 1439 Ash Street in Terre Haute. It's an 8-man tournament featuring names like Joey O'Reilly, Samnite, and many more. Doors open at 6 both nights, and the shows are at 7. That's Eastern Time. You can buy tickets for one show. There's $7 general admission or $10 for the VIP experience. You can also buy combo tickets for both nights, $12 for general admission and $18 for the VIP experience. Check them out on Facebook at New Wave Pro Wrestling. June 23rd and 24th, a 2-day event comes to the Shriners Fest in Evansville, and our partner Coliseum Championship Wrestling presents Battle on the Ohio. Lots of big names on the card, so be sure to make your way down to Evansville Shriner Fest on the 23rd and 24th. Bell time is at 6 p.m. Central Time, both evenings. Also, on June 25th at the Veterans Memorial Coliseum in Evansville, that's at 300 Court Street, CCW presents Revolution. Tickets are $10 at the door for that event, $5 with military ID. Kids 5 and under are free. VIP tables are available. For more information, you can check out the CCW Facebook page or give them a call, 812-402-1862. June 25th at the Vincent's Eagles Lodge, Tri-State Wrestling hosts their version of WrestleMania, Night of Champions. Will Bray takes on Zach Hogan in an I Quit match for the TSW World Heavyweight Championship. Special start time for this event at 5:30. Doors open at that time. 10 Count Blog will be there doing a live podcast with several of the guys performing that evening. 6:30 they have the TSW Hall of Fame ceremony, and then at 7 we kick off the show. July 9th, WWE Live is making their way to Danville, Illinois in the SummerSlam Heatwave Tour. They'll be at the David S. Palmer Arena for that show beginning at 7:30 Central Time. Names like Becky Lynch, Enzo and Cass, Bray Wyatt, Dean Ambrose, and many more. Check out the Ticketmaster outlet or WWE app for tickets. July 14th, NXT Live is coming to Indianapolis at the Old National Center. 7:30 Eastern Time start on that show. Asuka, Bayley, Finn Balor, Samoa Joe, Shinsuke Nakamura among the names on the card for that show. Again, check out Ticketmaster or the WWE app for ticket information. Finally, Saturday, August the 13th, Massive Wrestling presents Uprising at the Vincennes University Green Activities Center. Doors open at 6 p.m. Bell time is at 7. That's Eastern Time. Tickets go on sale June 13th. You can get them in advance for $5 or at the door for $10. More information is forthcoming about this show. Be sure to support your local indie promotions by checking them out on social media and their websites. Find all that information on our local indie promotions page at 10countblog.wordpress.com. Before we go, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes and SoundCloud, and then go rate us. Help the world know about 10 Count Blog and 10 Count Podcast. Get us on the new and noteworthy list on iTunes. Also, don't forget to check us out on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. You can find links to all of those on this article at 10countblog.wordpress.com. You can also check out our social media and podcast page. We're always accepting blog submissions. If you want to write something about wrestling, it can be about any topic wrestling related. Send it to us at 10countblog@gmail.com. Thanks to Rollick for allowing us to use Snorkeling into Oblivion as our theme song. Check them out on Facebook and download their music for free. Be sure to check out the Rollick Frolic June 25th at the Vincennes Riverfront Pavilion. Don't forget to visit 10countblog.wordpress.com, subscribe on iTunes and SoundCloud, and rate us. Seriously, it takes about 5 minutes, guys. We'll be back next week with a guest to be announced a little bit later on. Until then, thanks for listening to the 10 Count Podcast.